On the night of April 26, 1977, a line of people stretched 6 city blocks down West 54th Street in Manhattan. Not all of them would get in. Most of them wouldn't. That was the point. Inside, Halston was dancing with Lisa Minnelli. Andy Warhol was watching everything with those pale, unreadable eyes, silver wig catching the light. The bartenders were pouring drinks for free. The drugs were everywhere, and no one was pretending otherwise. And behind the scenes, in a cramped office above the dance floor, 2 men were stuffing cash, tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes hundreds of thousands in a single night, into garbage bags, into the walls, into filing cabinets. They thought they were untouchable. They had every reason to believe they were. Within 2 years, federal agents would raid that building. Within 3, both men would be in federal prison. And within a decade, one of them would be dead. This is the story of Ian Schrager, a Brooklyn-born lawyer's son who co-created the most famous nightclub in American history, built a hospitality empire worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $600 million, and then watched it collapse almost entirely because of a maintenance worker who found a garbage bag in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ian Schrager grew up in Flatbush, Brooklyn, the son of a man with mob-adjacent connections who died when Ian was 17. The loss was formative. He studied law at Syracuse University, where he met Steve Rubel, a fast-talking, hypersocial kid from Brooklyn who had an almost supernatural ability to make people feel seen. They were an odd pairing. Schrager was the cerebral one, the strategic operator who thought 3 steps ahead. Rubel was the id, the engine, the guy who would pull a celebrity off the sidewalk and make them feel like the most important person alive. Together, they were something the nightlife world had never quite encountered. Their first venture was a steak restaurant in Queens, then a couple of bars in Rockville Center, Long Island, a beach club called Enchanted Garden, low-key operations, learning experiences. They were paying attention. They were watching how people moved through spaces, what made someone feel special, what made them want to come back. That education would be worth more than anything they learned in school. By 1977, they had located an abandoned CBS television studio on West 54th Street in Midtown Manhattan. The building was enormous, a cavernous, cathedral-like space with a stage, a balcony, catwalks above the dance floor. They leased it, hired theatrical lighting designers, spent money they barely had on a sound system that could rattle the walls. They named it Studio 54. And on April 26, 1977, they opened the doors. The line that formed that first night never really went away. What Schrager and Rubel had invented, and it is not an exaggeration to use that word, was the velvetrope economy, the idea that exclusion was itself the product, that the most valuable thing you could sell to a wealthy person wasn't the drink in their hand, but the knowledge that someone else wasn't allowed to have one. The door policy was theatrical, arbitrary, brilliant, beautiful people, famous people, interesting people, sometimes nobodies who caught Steve Rubel's eye. The point was that you never knew, and the uncertainty was intoxicating. Inside, the experience matched the mythology. The lighting was cinematic, designed by Jules Fisher, who had worked on Broadway shows. The music was deafening and relentless. The crowd was unlike any assembled anywhere. Studio 54 was one of the few places in New York where a gay kid from Queens could dance next to Mick Jagger, where a black drag queen and a Park Avenue socialite occupied the same few square feet of dance floor without anyone thinking twice. It was utopian in a way that was also completely, deliberately commercial. The money was extraordinary. At their peak, Studio 54 was pulling in something like $1 million a week in revenue, not a year, a week. And Schrager and Rubel, rather than running this through standard accounts and paying standard taxes, began systematically skimming the top, cash before it hit the books, bags of it. Rubel, in a moment of spectacular hubris, told a reporter on the record that only the mafia made more money than Studio 54. He meant it as a boast. Federal prosecutors read it as an invitation. By 1978, the IRS and the U.S. Attorney's Office had begun building a case. On December 14th of that year, federal agents raided Studio 54 during one of its regular nights of operation. What they found in that office above the dance floor went beyond anything they had expected. Cash stuffed into the ceiling, cash in filing cabinets, cash in the wall. And in an air duct, discovered not by investigators, but by a maintenance worker, a garbage bag containing approximately $2.5 million in currency, just sitting there. The irony is almost too neat. These two men had built an empire out of making people feel watched, curated, selected, and they were brought down because they didn't notice a single garbage bag in a ventilation shaft. At the time of the raid, Schrager and Rubel were worth, by various estimates, somewhere between $100 and $500 million in today's terms. Studio 54 alone was valued as a business in the tens of millions. They had equity in the building, they had cash reserves, they had plans. There was talk of expansion, of taking the Studio 54 concept to other cities, of a brand. They hired lawyers, they fought. For a time, it seemed possible they might negotiate their way out with fines and probation. They did not. In 1979, Ian Schrager and Steve Rubel pleaded guilty to tax evasion. As part of their plea agreement, they cooperated with federal investigators. The precise nature and extent of that cooperation has never been fully made public, but it is widely believed they provided information about organized crime figures who had business dealings with the club. The sentencing, which many observers expected to be lenient given that cooperation, was not. They each received 3.5 years in federal prison. Schrager served 13 months at Maxwell Air Force Base Federal Prison Camp in Alabama. Think about what that means in physical terms. 13 months before, the most glamorous room in the world. 13 months later, a federal prison camp. The distance between those two coordinates, traveled in a single year, is difficult to wrap your mind around. Rubel served the same sentence. He emerged from prison visibly diminished, thinner, quieter. In 1989, at the age of 45, he died of complications from AIDS-related septicemia. The disease had likely been contracted before prison. The timeline is uncertain. What is not uncertain is that the man who had the gift of making everyone feel special died quietly, outside the circle of light, in a world that had moved on from the room he built. Schrager came out of prison in his early 40s with what various accounts describe as very little. The business was gone. The assets had been liquidated, sold, transferred as part of the legal settlements. The cash in the walls was, obviously, gone. Studio 54 itself had been sold. It would go through several owners before eventually becoming a Broadway theater, which it remains today. If you have ever seen a show at Studio 54 on West 54th Street, you have stood inside what was once the most expensive room in America. For someone else, this might have been the end. For Schrager, it was, by his own account, the beginning of the most important education of his life. He had a business mind that prison had not touched. He understood, at a cellular level, what made a space feel special, what made a person feel, the moment they walked through a door, that they were somewhere worth being, and he began applying that knowledge to hotels. The theory was this: hotels in the 1980s were either luxury monuments with marble lobbies and no personality, or budget operations with personality and no luxury. There was almost nothing in between that offered genuine aesthetic ambition. Schrager decided to build boutique hotels, small, architecturally distinctive, design-forward properties where the lobby functioned like a Studio 54 in miniature, a place where you wanted to be seen. A place where the act of checking in felt like being selected. In 1984, he partnered with Rubel, who was still alive and still his closest collaborator, and they opened Morgan's Hotel on Madison Avenue. The rooms were designed by Andre Putman. The lobby was intimate and odd and completely unlike anything else in New York. There was no sign outside. The discretion was deliberate. It was the velvet rope translated into architecture. It worked. Then came Royalton, then Paramount, then a string of hotels that collectively invented a category now known as boutique hospitality. Ian Schrager Hotels became a brand, and not just any brand, but the original, the template. The W Hotels, the Ace, the Edition, the Thompson, the Soho House model, all of them trace a lineage back to what Schrager built in the late 1980s and 1990s. By the late 1990s, he had done it again. He had taken a near-nothing and rebuilt it into something worth hundreds of millions. The estimates of the value of his hotel portfolio at its peak reach as high as $600 million. And then the second collapse came. In 2004, Schrager's hotel company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The causes were multiple and compounding. The September 11 attacks had devastated New York's hospitality sector, a sector already facing a slowdown. Schrager had borrowed heavily to expand Delano in Miami, Mondrian in Los Angeles, Hudson in New York, the Clift in San Francisco. The debt structure was aggressive. When the revenue fell, the margins disappeared, and the debt did not. He lost the hotels. Most of them were taken over by other operators, other groups, other investors. The business he had rebuilt from essentially nothing was gone a second time. What distinguishes Schrager's story from most rise and fall narratives is what happens after the falls. He did not disappear. He did not retire to irrelevance. In 2012, he entered a partnership with Marriott International to create a new brand called Edition Hotels, boutique properties developed under his creative direction, backed by the largest hotel company on earth. He maintained his aesthetic control. He let someone else carry the debt. Edition Hotels now operates properties in New York, London, Barcelona, Miami, Tokyo. Some of those rooms cost more than $5,000 a night. The brand is regarded as among the finest in the world. The transformation from garbage bags in the wall to $5,000 hotel rooms, and then back again, and then forward again, is the kind of arc that resists easy summary. Schrager has said in interviews that prison gave him perspective, that it stripped away the noise, that it clarified what he actually wanted to do with his time on Earth. Those are the words of someone who has processed a trauma into a narrative, but there is also something there that seems genuinely true. The man who emerged from Maxwell Air Force Base Federal Prison Camp in the early 1980s was a different kind of operator than the man who walked in. Less interested in the theater of excess for its own sake, more interested in what the theater was actually for. What Studio 54 was about, at its core, was making people feel alive. Schrager understood that the luxury wasn't the champagne or the lighting or the famous faces. The luxury was the feeling that the world, for one night, had organized itself around you. He just spent 40 more years figuring out how to deliver that feeling without a garbage bag full of cash in the ceiling. Steve Rubel never got those 40 years. He died at 45, the year that Schrager's hotel company was first turning real profit. What Rubel would have made of the Edition Hotels, of the Marriott partnership, of a legacy measured in design awards rather than door receipts, is one of those questions that hangs in the air without an answer. What we're left with is this: a man who stood at the summit twice, fell twice, and built a third summit in his 60s. The first fall was spectacularly his own fault. The tax evasion was not a mistake. It was a sustained, deliberate choice made by men who believed the rules were for other people. The second fall was partly circumstance, partly overreach. And the recovery, both times, was entirely a function of a mind that kept working even when everything around it had gone dark. There's a lesson somewhere in that sequence, though it resists being stated too cleanly. It's not that crime doesn't pay. Crime paid Schrager and Rubel very well, right up until the moment it didn't. It's not that resilience always wins. Steve Rubel was plenty resilient, and the world took him anyway. It might just be that the people who build extraordinary things build them because they cannot stop, because the building is the point. Because whatever else is stripped away, the money, the glamour, the freedom, the compulsion to make a room that feels like nowhere else on earth turns out to be the one thing that doesn't fit in a garbage bag. The line still starts at the door. It always does for people like this. The question is always just, what are they building when you get inside?